At work, a new case waited on her desk. But now, when she coordinated with local police, there was real cooperation. The us versus them mentality was fading, replaced by a shared commitment to doing things right. A rookie officer stopped by her office. "Agent Thompson, got a situation I could use your advice on. Want to make sure I handle it the right way." Riley gestured to the chair across from her desk. This was how real change happened. One conversation, one decision, one moment of courage at a time. Outside her window, the city stretched out under the morning sun. Somewhere out there, another Officer Barrett might be abusing their power. But now there was a system in place to stop them, and people brave enough to speak up. The wall of silence hadn't just been broken, it had been replaced by something stronger. A culture of integrity, accountability, and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was real progress. And that, Riley thought as she turned to help the young officer, was worth every moment of the fight. 6 months had passed since Riley's evidence went public. The FBI building looked the same from the outside, but inside, everything had changed. As she walked through the lobby, younger agents nodded with respect. Some she'd never even met knew her story. Today was different, though. The conference room was packed with faces from both the FBI and local police department. Riley stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. 6 months ago, we exposed a problem, she began. But exposing problems isn't enough. Today, we're here to talk about solutions. In the front row sat Officer Lee, now promoted to detective. Behind her were several officers who'd come forward with their own stories. Even Mr. Washington had put on his best suit for the occasion. "The old training manual is gone," Riley continued, holding up a new tablet. "In its place, we've developed something better. Real scenarios, real consequences, real change." The screen behind her lit up with statistics. Complaints down 60%, minority recruitment up 45%, community trust improving across all metrics. But numbers weren't the whole story. During the break, Riley found a quiet corner with Agent Patel. "Remember when they tried to transfer me to Salt Lake City?" she asked with a small smile. "Now they're sending departments from other cities to learn from us," he replied. "Funny how things work out." The afternoon session was more personal. Officers who'd faced discrimination shared their stories. Community members spoke about their experiences. Even some former problem officers who'd gone through the new training program talked about changing their perspectives. "It's not about punishment," Riley explained to the group. "It's about transformation. We're building a new culture, one person at a time." Barrett wasn't there. He'd resigned months ago when the evidence became public. But his departure had been just the beginning. The real work came after, in the quiet moments of change. Later that day, Riley visited the police academy where new recruits were going through the training program she'd helped design. A young black woman in uniform approached her. "Man," she said, "your story is why I joined. I wanted to be part of the change." Riley watched the training session, remembering her own early days in law. Agent Patel pulled up more files on his laptop. "Already on it. Got confirmation that similar patterns exist in 3 other major cities. Officers there are ready to come forward too." Mr. Washington smiled from his corner. "Dominoes," he said quietly. "Once the first one falls." Riley's phone buzzed with a text from the Internal Affairs detective. "Police chief just called emergency meeting. They're panicking." "Of course they are," Riley replied. "We have proof of every cover-up, every buried complaint, every lost piece of evidence. And more importantly, we have people willing to testify." As night fell, Riley stood at her window, watching the news vans outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, press conferences, official investigations, probably more threats. But for the first time in months, she felt truly free. Her mother came to stand beside her. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly. Riley thought about all the officers like Barrett who'd abused their power for years, thinking they were untouchable. She thought about every person who'd faced discrimination and stayed quiet out of fear. She thought about Officer Lee and the others who'd found their courage. "This isn't just about getting justice for what happened to me," Riley said. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Her phone lit up with another message, this time from a police officer in another state. "Saw the news. We have similar problems here. Can you help?" Riley smiled as she typed her response. The wall of silence hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. And through those broken pieces, a new kind of law enforcement might finally have a chance to emerge, one built on integrity, accountability, and real justice for all. Riley sat in her home office at dawn, watching the sun rise through her window. Her dining room had transformed into a command center with evidence covering every surface. But today was different. Today, she was done playing defense. Her phone rang. Officer Lee's voice was urgent. "They're cleaning house. Internal Affairs just confiscated my files. They're trying to shut us all down." "Perfect timing," Riley replied, surprisingly calm. "Are you still willing to go on record?" "What do you mean?" "Meet me at the coffee shop in an hour. Bring anyone else who's ready to speak up." Riley hung up and opened her laptop. The email she prepared last night was still there, waiting to be sent. Attached were carefully selected documents, photos, and testimony, not everything she had, but enough to prove her case. The recipient list included the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and 3 trusted journalists she'd vetted thoroughly. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. Sometimes you have to lose something to gain everything. The coffee shop was crowded when she arrived. Officer Lee had brought 4 other officers. Mr. Washington sat in his usual corner. Agent Patel arrived with 2 more FBI agents who'd witnessed Barrett's interference with federal operations. "Before we start," Riley addressed the group, "I want you all to understand what's about to happen. There's no going back from this." One of the younger officers spoke up. "We knew that when we came forward. We're tired of being part of the problem." Riley nodded and pressed send on her laptop. Within minutes, her phone started buzzing nonstop. She ignored it. Instead, she opened a video conference call. On the screen appeared faces from across the country, civil rights attorneys, police reform advocates, and officers from other cities who'd fought similar battles. "The documents are out," Riley told them. "Phase 2 starts now." The next few hours were a blur of activity. The journalists she'd contacted started publishing their stories, each focusing on different aspects of the evidence. Social media exploded with reactions. The police department's phones were ringing off the hook. By noon, the FBI deputy director was calling an emergency press conference. Riley watched it on her laptop, surrounded by her allies. His face was tight with controlled anger as he announced a full investigation into the allegations. "We take these claims very seriously," he said, looking directly into the cameras. "Any corruption or discrimination within law enforcement will be thoroughly investigated and dealt with." Officer Lee snorted. "Notice how they're acting like they just learned about this, after ignoring us for months." "That's why we're not done," Riley said, pulling out a fresh stack of documents. "They think this is just about Barrett and his friends. They don't realize we're exposing the whole system that protected them." Her phone rang. Assistant Director Wells. "You've started a war," Wells said without preamble. "No," Riley replied. "I'm finishing one that's been going on far too long." The afternoon brought waves of reactions. Some officers publicly resigned. Others came forward with their own stories. Barrett himself was nowhere to be found, reportedly called in sick. Riley's mother showed up with food, worry etched on her face. "The news vans are starting to gather outside." "Good," Riley said, hugging her. "Let them come." As evening approached, Riley gathered her core group. The initial shockwaves were settling, but the real work was just beginning. "They'll try to control the narrative," she explained. "Paint this as a few bad apples, promise some reforms, hope it all dies down. We can't let that happen." "Mom, remember when you used to tell me about your days in the civil rights movement? How scared you were, but you kept going." "That was different," her mother protested. "Was it? You taught me that change doesn't come from being comfortable. It comes from standing your ground when things get hard." Later that night, alone in her living room, Riley reviewed everything. The evidence wall had grown so much it was spreading to a second wall. Her phone kept buzzing with supportive messages mixed with veiled threats. A car drove slowly past her house, not a police cruiser this time, but an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows. They were changing tactics, trying to intimidate her in new ways. She made herself a cup of tea, her father's favorite blend. The familiar smell brought back his words. "Baby girl, there's a difference between being scared and being stopped. It's okay to be scared, just don't let it stop you." Her laptop pinged with a new email from an anonymous account. More evidence, more stories, more proof that this went deeper than anyone had realized. The wall of silence wasn't just cracking now, it was starting to crumble. Riley looked at her badge sitting on the coffee table. Administrative leave or not, she was still an FBI agent. She'd sworn an oath to uphold the law and protect people's rights. Sometimes that meant protecting them from the very people who were supposed to be the guardians. A text from Officer Lee lit up her phone. "They're trying to pressure me to recant. I won't. We're all behind you." Riley smiled, feeling a new kind of strength. They could try to isolate her, threaten her career, even intimidate her at home. But they couldn't stop what was already in motion. The truth had its own momentum now, carried forward by dozens of voices that had been silent for too long. The conference room felt smaller than usual as Riley sat facing the panel of senior officials. 5 stern faces looked back at her across the polished table. The morning sun cast long shadows through the blinds, creating bars of light and dark across the room. Agent Thompson, the FBI deputy director, began, his voice carefully neutral. "We've reviewed your collection of complaints and evidence. While we appreciate your dedication to proper procedure, there are concerns about your methods." Riley kept her face composed, though her heart was racing. "Sir, every piece of evidence was obtained legally and properly documented." "That's not the issue," another official cut in. She recognized him as Chief Rogers from the police department. "The issue is the disruption this is causing to both our departments. Morale is down. Officers are looking over their shoulders instead of doing their jobs." "With respect, sir," Riley replied, "maybe they should be looking over their shoulders if they're not doing their jobs properly." A quiet murmur ran through the panel. Assistant Director Wells, the only familiar face there, gave Riley a warning look. "We have a proposal," the deputy director continued. "There's an opening in our Salt Lake City office. Supervisory position, fast track to advancement. A fresh start, away from all this unpleasantness." The offer hung in the air. Riley thought about her comfortable apartment, her mother just across town, the life she built here. Then she thought about Officer Lee and the others who trusted her with their stories. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I don't believe running away solves the underlying problem." "This isn't a request, Agent Thompson. It's a strongly suggested career move." Before Riley could respond, her phone buzzed. Then another official's phone went off, and another. Soon, everyone in the room was looking at their devices. The local news website's headline read, "Anonymous sources reveal pattern of discrimination in police department." Below were redacted copies of some of the documents Riley had collected, along with new ones she'd never seen. "I didn't do this," Riley said quickly, seeing the accusation in their faces. Meeting adjourned, the deputy director snapped. "Agent Thompson, consider yourself on administrative leave pending investigation." In the hallway, Wells caught up with her. "Tell me straight, did you leak those documents?" "No," Riley said firmly. "But I know what this means. They're going to try to discredit everything, make it look like I orchestrated some kind of smear campaign." "Go home," Wells advised. "Lay low. This is going to get ugly." At home, Riley found her front door unlocked, though nothing seemed disturbed inside. A warning. Her phone had been ringing nonstop. Reporters, other agents, her mother worried sick. She was making coffee when someone knocked. Through the peephole, she saw Agent Patel. "You've got to see this," he said, hurrying in with his laptop. "Remember those deleted files we found? There's more. Way more. Someone on the inside is starting to talk." They spent hours going through new evidence. Messages from other precincts, similar patterns, cover-ups going back years. Her dining room wall was now a complex web of connections and incidents. Her doorbell rang again. This time it was Mr. Washington, still in his janitor's uniform. "Thought you might need these," he said, handing her a stack of papers. "Been keeping my own records all these years. Never knew when they might be useful." As the day turned to evening, more visitors came. Officer Lee brought food and 3 more officers willing to testify. The internal affairs detective arrived with updated files. Even a few senior officers, ones Riley had never expected to support her, sent messages through secure channels. Her mother called again. "Baby, I'm worried. Maybe you should take that transfer." "I'm not alone anymore, Mom," she replied. All this time they've been trying to isolate me, make me feel like I was the problem. But there are so many others, they were just waiting for someone to go first. After hanging up, Riley started organizing the evidence into categories. Her dining room was becoming a command center with sticky notes and timeline charts covering one wall. Her phone kept buzzing with new messages, more officers wanting to share their stories, community activists offering support, even a reporter asking careful questions about department policies. What had started as one confrontation was growing into something bigger. Every person who spoke up seemed to encourage two more to find their courage. As she worked late into the night, Riley remembered Barrett's smug face during that first traffic stop, how he'd assumed she would just take the humiliation and stay quiet. He couldn't have known that his actions would trigger this cascade of truth-telling. The wall of silence was cracking, and through those cracks, years of suppressed stories were finally flowing free. Riley realized that maybe this was how change really happened, not through one big dramatic moment, but through countless small acts of courage, building and building until the old ways simply couldn't hold anymore. The coffee shop 2 blocks from the FBI building had become Riley's unofficial meeting spot. It was busy enough to provide cover, but quiet enough for private conversations. She sat in a corner booth, watching the door while pretending to read a newspaper. Right on time, a young police officer walked in. Officer Lee was newer to the force, barely 2 years in. She ordered a coffee and sat down across from Riley, her hands fidgeting with her cup. "I shouldn't be here," Lee whispered, glancing around nervously. "If they find out." "Nobody's watching," Riley assured her. "Tell me what made you reach out." Lee pulled out her phone, hands shaking slightly. "I've been keeping records," she said, pulling up a folder of photos and videos. "At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things. But after what happened with you..." Riley watched as Lee scrolled through dozens of documented incidents. Barrett and his friends targeting minority drivers, making mistakes on reports involving female officers, mysterious technical failures during certain arrests. "Look at this one," Lee said, showing a text message chain. "They have a whole system. They warn each other when Internal Affairs is watching, coordinate their stories." An older man approached their table, making Lee jump. It was just Mr. Washington, the night janitor from the FBI building, carrying his own coffee. "Mind if I join you, ladies?" he asked, sitting down before they could answer. "Been watching all this unfold. Thought you might want to hear a story from back in '82. Riley noticed how Lee relaxed slightly at the old man's grandfatherly presence. Mr. Washington pulled out an aged leather wallet, removing a folded newspaper clipping. "See this?" he said, smoothing the yellow paper. "That's me, 25 years younger, testifying about similar things in the department. They'd pushed me out eventually, but some good came from it. Got 3 officers fired, made some changes." "What happened to the others?" Lee asked quietly. "Some stayed quiet, kept their heads down. Others left the force. But a few," he smiled, "a few stood up. Started a support group that still meets today." Riley's phone buzzed. A message from Agent Patel. "You need to see this. My office, ASAP." "I have to go," Riley said, standing. "Officer Lee, would you be willing to make official statements about what you've shown me?" Lee took a deep breath. Yes, but I'm not the only one. There are others who've seen things, kept records. They're scared, but maybe if someone went first." "Give them my number," Riley said, writing it down. "And Mr. Washington's story shows this isn't new, but maybe this time we can make real change." At the FBI office, Patel was waiting with more evidence. His cousin in another precinct had started asking questions, and officers there were talking. "Barrett's got a history," Patel explained, spreading files across his desk. 3 different departments in 10 years. Never fired, just transferred when things got hot. "Let me guess," Riley said, "the complaints disappeared every time." "Until now." Patel grinned. "Their digital security isn't as good as they think. Found some interesting deleted files." As they reviewed the documents, Riley's office phone rang. It was a detective from Internal Affairs, not one of Barrett's friends. "Agent Thompson, I think we need to talk. Just not here. Can you meet me at the diner on 5th? The diner was almost empty when Riley arrived. The detective sat in a back booth, a thick folder in front of him. "I've been building a case for months," he said without preamble. misconduct, corruption, civil rights violations. But I needed something solid, something they couldn't bury. Your complaint. That was the thread that started unraveling everything. Back at home that evening, Riley spread all the new evidence across her dining room table. Her mother called, as she did every evening now. "Baby, you sound different today," she said. "What's changed?" Riley looked at the growing pile of documents, the text messages from other officers wanting to talk, Mr. Washington's newspaper clipping. Riley stared at the message, thinking about how to respond. She thought about the scared young woman they'd rescued today, how things could have gone wrong because one officer decided his prejudice was more important than his duty. "I'm okay, Mom," she typed back. "Just realizing this fight is bigger than I thought." She spread the documents out on her table, starting to organize them systematically. If Barrett and his allies wanted to play dirty, they'd learn she could play smart. Every incident, every email, every report painted a picture not just of personal racism, but of systemic corruption that put lives at risk. As she worked, she remembered something her father, a former civil rights attorney, used to say: "Sometimes it takes one crack to bring down the whole dam." Looking at the evidence before her, Riley realized that's exactly what her original complaint had been. A crack in a dam of corruption and cover-ups. Now the pressure was building and something had to give. She pulled out a fresh notepad and began writing. This wasn't just about filing complaints anymore. This was about exposing a culture of corruption that had festered too long in the shadows. Barrett and his friends had just made a critical mistake. They'd given her the ammunition she needed to take this fight to a whole new level. The night grew late as Riley worked, but she barely noticed. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly focused. They thought they could wear her down, but they'd only succeeded in showing her exactly how deep this problem went. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would start fighting back. The morning started like any other at the FBI field office, but Riley could feel something different in the air. Her team was preparing for a major operation. Months of work tracking a human trafficking ring was about to culminate in coordinated raids across the city. They needed perfect coordination with local law enforcement to pull it off. "All teams check in," Riley spoke into her comm unit standing in the command center. One by one, the FBI teams reported ready. Then came the police unit's check-ins. Officer Barrett's voice crackled through last, almost casual, Unit 47, standing by. Riley's heart skipped. She hadn't expected Barrett to be assigned to this operation. She caught Assistant Director Wells' eye across the room, who gave her a slight nod. They both knew this wasn't a coincidence. "Remember," Riley addressed all units, "timing is crucial. We move on my mark, not before. Lives are at stake." The operation began smoothly. Riley's team approached their target location, an abandoned warehouse by the docks. They needed the police units to secure the perimeter while FBI teams breached the building. "Unit 47, confirm position at the south exit," Riley commanded. Static answered. "Unit 47, respond." More static. Through her binoculars, Riley could see Barrett's patrol car, but it wasn't at its assigned position. It was parked a block away, leaving a critical escape route uncovered. "Change of plans," Barrett's voice finally came through, dripping with fake concern. "Thought I saw suspicious activity nearby. Had to check it out." Riley's blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was deliberately endangering an operation. She made a split-second decision. "All units, adjust formation," she ordered, quickly reorganizing the teams to cover the gap. They couldn't abort now. Victims were waiting to be rescued. The next 15 minutes were chaos. As predicted, the traffickers tried to flee through the unguarded south exit. Riley's team had to split up, stretching themselves thin to cover the escape route Barrett had abandoned. In the end, they caught the perpetrators and rescued the victims, but it had been much closer than it should have been. One agent took a minor injury in the scramble, and 2 suspects almost got away. Back at the field office, Riley sat in Wells' office, her hands shaking with suppressed anger as she filed her report. "He knew exactly what he was doing," she said, her voice tight. "He put everyone at risk, agents, victims, even his fellow officers, just to prove a point." Wells nodded, her face grim. "This crosses a line. It's one thing to make your job difficult, but endangering a federal operation, that's another level entirely." Riley looked down at her hands. You know what really gets me? If anything had gone wrong today, they would have blamed me. Said my personal vendetta against Barrett affected my judgment. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Agent Patel, holding a USB drive. You need to see this, he said, plugging it into Wells's computer. Remember that tech issue last week with the missing surveillance reports? Well, I did some digging. The screen filled with recovered emails between Barrett and several other officers. They detailed a coordinated effort to disrupt FBI operations, specifically ones where Riley was in charge. They didn't count on me having friends in cyber, Patel said with a slight smile. Riley read through the emails, feeling a strange calm settle over her. This was no longer about one racist traffic stop or personal harassment. This was about officers willing to compromise public safety for their own agenda. Later that night, Riley sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers, her original complaint, documentation of every incident since, the recovered emails, today's operation report. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. You okay, baby? Haven't heard from you all day. Been watching what's happening to you, he said quietly, leaning on his mop. Reminds me of my days in the force, back in '82. Stood up against some bad officers, ended up leaving the job I loved. He paused, looking at her intently. But times are different now. You've got proof, you've got support. Don't let them wear you down. Riley drove home that night with Mr. Washington's words echoing in her mind. As she pulled onto her street, she noticed something different. No patrol cars tonight. Instead of feeling relieved, she felt uneasy. Something was shifting, but she couldn't tell if it was for better or worse. At home, she added the day's events to her growing file. Her mother had always told her that documentation was a form of protection. Write it all down, baby. Your truth on paper is harder to deny. As she got ready for bed, Riley caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back looked tired but determined. She thought about all the other officers who must have faced similar situations over the years, who might have backed down out of fear or exhaustion. Not this time, she whispered to her reflection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to break her spirit. But they didn't understand. Every obstacle they put in her path only strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about changing a system that had gone unchallenged for far too long. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday evening. Riley pulled into her driveway, grocery bags in the back seat, when she noticed the police cruiser crawling past her house for the third time that day. She didn't recognize the officer behind the wheel, but the message was clear. They were watching. Inside her home, she set down her groceries and pulled out her notebook, documenting the time and cruiser number. The pages were already filling up with similar incidents from the past 2 weeks. Her phone lit up with a text from Agent Patel. Heads up. Barrett's back on duty. Riley's stomach tightened. Officer Barrett's 3-day suspension had been a joke, barely a slap on the wrist. Now he was back, and things were getting complicated. The next morning, Riley sat in the FBI officer's conference room, preparing for a briefing on a major drug trafficking case. The local police department was supposed to provide crucial surveillance data, but when she opened the file, half the reports were missing. Technical issues, the police liaison claimed with a shrug that didn't quite hide his smirk. You know how it goes. Riley kept her face neutral, even as anger simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't just about her anymore. They were intentionally hindering federal investigations. Everything okay? Agent Patel asked as they walked back to their desks. They're playing games, Riley replied, keeping her voice low. Barrett's friends are making sure we feel the pressure. It's not just that, Patel said, glancing around before continuing. I heard they're spreading rumors about you at the police department, saying you've got a vendetta against cops, that you're trying to start trouble. Riley almost laughed. A vendetta? I followed every protocol, filed every form correctly. The dashcam footage speaks for itself. You know that's not how they see it. Patel leaned against her desk. Listen, my cousin's a cop in another district. He says Barrett's got connections, family in the union, friends in high places. Before Riley could respond, her computer pinged with an urgent alert. A suspect they'd been tracking for weeks had been spotted near the harbor. They needed to move fast, and they needed local police backup. This is Agent Thompson requesting immediate assistance at the harbor district. Riley spoke clearly into her radio. The response came back with suspicious static. "Repeat location," the dispatcher said, though Riley knew her transmission had been perfectly clear. Precious minutes ticked by as she repeated the information, watching their suspect's movement on the tracking system. By the time they got to the scene, he was long gone. Back at the office, Riley's frustration reached a breaking point. She marched into Assistant Director Wells' office, documentation in hand. "They're deliberately slowing us down," she said, spreading the evidence on Wells's desk. "Missing reports, delayed responses, suspicious technical issues, all since I'd filed that complaint." Wells reviewed the papers, her expression growing darker. "This goes beyond personal harassment. They're obstructing federal investigations." "And it's going to get worse," Riley added. "Barrett's got everyone convinced I'm on some crusade against the police department." "Maybe you should take a few days off," Wells suggested, though her tone made it clear she knew Riley wouldn't agree. "That's exactly what they want," Riley said, straightening her shoulders. "They're hoping I'll back down, maybe even request a transfer, but this is bigger than me now." Later that evening, as Riley walked to her car in the parking garage, she heard footsteps behind her. Her hand instinctively moved toward her weapon, but it was just the night janitor, Mr. Washington, an elderly man who'd worked in the building for decades. Special Agent Riley Thompson stared at the family photo on her desk, her fingers tracing the silver frame as morning sunlight streamed through the FBI field office windows. The events from last week's traffic stop kept playing in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. She'd faced discrimination before, but something about this encounter with Officer Barrett felt different, maybe because she'd finally had enough. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Internal Affairs confirming they'd received her complaint. Riley took a deep breath, straightening the jacket of her perfectly pressed Navy suit. The weight of her FBI badge felt heavier than usual today. Around her, the office hummed with its usual morning energy, but she noticed the subtle changes, the quick glances, the hushed conversations that stopped when she walked by. "Got a minute?" Agent Patel, her partner of 3 years, knocked on her office door. His usually cheerful face looked concerned. Words spreading about what happened. "The police department's not happy." "They're not supposed to be happy," Riley replied, gesturing for him to come in. "What that officer did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal." Patel closed the door behind him and sat down. "Listen, I've got your back, 100%, but some of the other agents are worried this could make things complicated. We've got 3 joint operations coming up next month." Riley opened her laptop, pulling up the dashcam footage she'd requested. "Look at this," she said, turning the screen. The video showed her standing calmly, presenting her FBI credentials, while Officer Barrett's aggressive behavior escalated without cause. "Tell me what you see." Patel watched, his expression darkening. He was way out of line. "But Riley, you know how these things usually go. They'll protect their own." "That's exactly why this needs to happen," Riley said, closing the laptop. "I'm not that scared rookie anymore, hoping things will change if I just keep quiet and work twice as hard. I've earned my place here." A knock on her door interrupted them. Assistant Director Wells, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, entered without waiting for a response. "Agent Thompson, do you have a moment?" Patel excused himself, giving Riley a supportive nod as he left. The assistant director took his seat, her face unreadable. "I've reviewed your complaint," Wells began, her tone measured. "It's thorough, professional, exactly what I'd expect from you. But I need to know if you've considered all the implications." Riley sat straighter. "Ma'am, with respect, I'd thought about little else. The police union's already called. They're claiming it's a misunderstanding, suggesting perhaps you were oversensitive to the situation." Wells held up a hand as Riley started to protest. "I'm not saying I agree. I'm saying this is going to get messy." "Sometimes messy is necessary," Riley replied, thinking of her niece who wanted to be an FBI agent someday. "What message do we send if we let this slide? That having this badge means staying quiet when we see wrong." Wells studied her for a long moment. "You've got an impressive record, Riley. Fast-track potential. This could complicate things. If standing up for what's right complicates my career, then maybe we have bigger problems than one biased officer." Riley's voice was quiet but firm. A small smile crossed Wells's face. You know, you remind me of myself 20 years ago. Just be prepared. This won't be easy. After Wells left, Riley sat alone in her office, watching agents and analysts move through their day outside her window. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from her mother. "Proud of you, baby. Stay strong." The message brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She quickly wiped them away as her office phone rang. It was dispatch. They had a new case, a bank robbery in progress. Riley grabbed her jacket, checking her weapon and badge. Whatever battles lay ahead, right now she had a job to do. And she'd do it exactly as she always had, with excellence, integrity, and the quiet determination that had carried her this far. As she headed for the elevator with her case file, she noticed something different in the looks she was getting now. Behind the concern and uncertainty, there was respect. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the start of real change. The elevator doors closed, and Riley took a deep breath. Part of her wished she could go back to being just another agent, head down, playing it safe. But she knew those days were over. Sometimes courage wasn't about choosing to be brave, it was about choosing not to be silent anymore.